Module 5, Rights, Permissions and Privileges. In the previous module about responsibility, we saw how agents downstream have the ultimate position and opportunity to decide their own outcomes, more so than any other agent, in spite of their own limitations. Autonomy doesn't necessarily mean that agents can do anything they want, only that agents are the ones that can really try to help themselves in the final instance. In this section, I want to explore what this tells us about the issue of rights more closely. Rights are a highly misunderstood issue, distorted by expectations, impositions, and morality. What do we mean when we say that an agent, human or machine, has a right? This is another case where promise theory can clearly see through cultural and political narratives. Promises don't tell us about ethical or moral judgments, but they do tell us about permissions. A permission granted is just a promise to grant access to something controlled by the grantor. An autonomous agent can only promise its own resources. So another way of expressing autonomy is to say that an agent that's autonomous has permission or has the right to use its own resources, and it has the permission or right to offer its own internal resources as a service to others. Many of us misunderstand the issue of rights, say human rights, as a moral entitlement, without understanding where that entitlement comes from. It's about who grants permission for the accesses we crave. An entitlement is an imposition, and we know this is usually ineffective. If no one can grant a permission to enable a desired entitlement, the imposition is without merit. That leads to a lot of moral conflict, but here we're going to stay very pragmatic. In the context of small collaborations like companies and teams, permission is a simple concept, a privilege granted to be able to access an available service resource. Once we get to larger collaborations like societies, scale makes these questions more subtle. As usual, we want to sketch out the promise diagram for access granting interaction. You might have tried this already, and as usual, it's exactly the same kind of plus and minus promises we've seen elsewhere. There's an offer of permission to access something, and that promise might be accepted by the other. There are two protocols. The plus or offer promise might be advertised first as a kind of invitation to use. Or the minus acceptance promise might be advertised first as an invitation to supply. I'm looking for someone to lend me a pencil, for instance. Then the promise to borrow the pencil comes later. Let's also add that although I've written plus x and minus x as the representations of the offers and acceptances in this picture, the promises might not match precisely. The using agent accepting might want more or less than what's offered. As long as the offer and the promise of usage overlap in some compromise, access to the resource will be granted. Of course, we need to think about impositions too. Remember that an imposition is an attempt to induce cooperation, like a demand. For example, demanding access to X, say a party, without an invitation would be represented by this diagram. Remember, the solid arrow is meant to look like a fist. This is a minus or acceptance imposition because it's a demand to make use of a resource. I demand the right to be able to travel faster than light. I demand the right to a good life. These are not promises another agent can keep on behalf of another, though some politicians might claim to offer these. Impositions might actually induce lies and deceptions. As usual, impositions may be ineffective because the recipient of the imposition, in this case the resource owner, may be unready, unwilling, or even unable to respond to the demand. Of course, that doesn't necessarily stop agents from trying. As a short addendum, let's take a moment to think about what permission means in terms of rank and privilege. A rank is just a designation, an ordering of agents according to some assessment of their level of privilege. Suppose an agent S grants an agent R access to some resource, call it X. S promises X as a plus or offer promise, and we assume that R accepts it with its own minus or acceptance promise, which we haven't shown here. You can add it yourself. Then now R has the ability to make a new conditional promise that depends, conditionally, on its newly granted access. R can advertise its promise to access X to other agents, say as a badge, and indeed promise anything else that might depend on that access. This is what we mean by a rank. It's like sergeant stripes or a gold member card with access to the gold club. Climbing this ladder of privilege is about accepting permissions granted by another agent or superagent, which is the custodian of that privilege. A right, then, is just a promise of access or permission to something held by another agent. Privilege is the ability to make conditional promises that assume the promise of that access. We usually think of rank as being granted by some kind of authority, but the downstream principle tells us that privilege may come from many sources. To understand this better, we need to look at the meaning of authority, and that's in the next module.